You're talking with some friends from college, and the topic of abortion comes up. Your friend Zach says that he's completely pro-life. Abortion should be illegal. Your friends kind of look at him weird, and you realize this topic has really never come up with your group of friends before. You don't know where they stand. Zach kind of feels the pressure. He backs off a little bit and says, well, except in the case of, rape or where the mother's life is in danger, those should be exceptions. Then your friend Jen speaks up, and she says, I'm completely pro-choice. I think abortion should be legal. But then she also pauses and says, but I don't think abortion should be used as birth control. It's not for every situation. Really, it should only really be used in, extreme cases and in desperate cases. So you ask her, well, what do you mean by that? What are the extreme cases? When is abortion necessary? And she says, well, rape would definitely be one. And any time where the mother's life or health is in danger. What's the difference between Zach's position and Jen's? Is there one? We're going to discuss all this and more in today's episode of Lifetime with Katie. The most common thing I hear from pro-life people when they explain why they're not involved in the movement is that they don't know how to make the case for life with their friends and family. And they also don't think that they could have a productive conversation with a pro-choice person. Today I'm going to take both of those excuses away. We'll be covering some basic guidelines for conversations with pro-choice people, as well as some basic responses to pro-choice arguments. After that, I'll wrap up with some ways to get involved in the pro-life movement, whether talking to strangers is in your comfort zone or not. Part 1, Conversation Basics. Controversial issues like abortion can bring up some strong emotions, and conversations about these topics can quickly get heated. This is one of the biggest deterrents to getting involved in the pro-life movement. I'm going to give you 5 basic rules to follow when the topic of abortion comes up. If you stick to these, your conversations will be smoother, calmer, and much more effective. Rule number 1, listen first. It's really easy to start rattling off your own set of pro-life rhetoric, your own set of arguments that you've heard from wherever, slogans that you've seen on a meme somewhere, or even just your own ideas that pop into your head. However, when two people start shouting rhetoric at each other, nothing good comes out of that. So the first thing to do is to listen to the other person. And when I say listen, I don't mean just wait for an opportunity to speak. I don't mean sit there and formulate what you're going to say next in your head. I mean actually listen. If you actually listen to the person who's talking to you and you're really processing what they're saying, what you'll find is that when they're done speaking, you're not going to have anything to say. And that's good. That means that you're listening. It means that you're thinking. If they finish speaking and you have to take a moment to process what you're going to say next, they will feel heard and they will feel much more understood. When the other person you're speaking to feels heard and understood, they are much more willing to actively listen to you. And when both parties are actively listening to each other, much more productive conversations happen. Rule number 2, ask clarifying questions. As in the example in my introduction with Zach and Jen, who had very, very similar points of view on abortion, but they use different labels, you need to clarify what the other person really believes. Just because they say they're pro-life or they're pro-choice or they believe this or that does not mean that that's the full extent of what they think about abortion. Most of the time we give ourselves labels, we give ourselves rhetoric, and we stick to those and we don't deviate from them. However, what most people really believe is much more nuanced than any kind of black or white, pro-life or pro-choice, polar kind of argument. The reality is much more subtle, is much more confusing. So when somebody tells you they support abortion, they're pro-choice, you need to ask them why. You need to ask them under what circumstances, and you need to give them the opportunity to explain their beliefs. Rule number 3, stay calm. I've traveled all across the country and spoken with all kinds of people about the issue of abortion. And in that time, I've been threatened, I've been called names, I've been yelled at, I've seen all kinds of things. And what I've found is that it is never helpful and it is never productive to match that energy with a similar combative, argumentative approach. Instead, what I found is that when I stay calm, despite what I'm being called, despite what the other person is saying, even if they're telling me that they think every single human being in the womb should be aborted, that nobody should ever be born again, whatever it is that they're saying, I find that if I remain calm, it gets harder and harder for them to justify their own anger and their own viewpoint. And when I'm calm and they're yelling at me, they quickly realize that I'm being the open-minded one here and that they're being closed-minded, stubborn, and single-track-minded. So when that's happened, I've had people apologize to me. I've had people just walk away and then sometimes come back later and apologize. And I've also just had people calm down and be willing to listen. So it's definitely worth taking a deep breath, letting the person rant, letting the person yell at you, letting them call you names. Just let them get it all out there. I've also found that 9 times out of 10, when I'm talking with somebody about abortion and they become extremely emotional, it's because they have a personal experience with abortion in their past. Whether they had one themselves, someone they love had one, whatever the case may be. But I found that if that's the case, if they have a personal connection to abortion, yelling at them will never accomplish anything. But letting them vent their frustrations, letting them vent their anger, just might. Rule number 4, make a follow-up plan. You cannot expect to convince somebody that abortion is wrong in one conversation. It's happened, but it is so unlikely and it is so difficult to do that really that should not be your expectation with every conversation. Especially if the person you're talking to is a close friend or family member, or a coworker for that matter. So it's really important that when you're talking to somebody about abortion, that you make a follow-up plan to talk to them and continue the conversation later. It's also important that if you run into something where they make an argument and you don't know how to answer it, that you don't make something up. You don't try and wiggle your way around the conversation, but then instead you take a step back and say, that's a really interesting point. I'd love to look into that, and I'd love to follow up with you at a later time. It's okay not to have all the answers then, and it's okay for them not to have all the answers as well. If you expect them to let you say, hey, let me look into that, let me get back to you, give them the same courtesy. If they don't have an answer to your argument, give them the out. Like, hey, if you want to look into this more, here's some resources. We can set up a time to talk about this again in the future. This will give them kind of an out because very few people will change their entire worldview on the spot. Most people are going to need time to process what they are listening to and what they're hearing. So giving them that out as well is really important. So just making a plan, understanding that this is not a one and done conversation. This is an ongoing relationship. This is where you're building rapport with this person. You're trying to understand them and you're trying to let them understand you. So having that sort of plan in place is extremely important to not only the conversation itself, but your ongoing relationship with that person, especially if they're somebody you already know. Part 2, conversation starters. If you're not sure how to bring up the topic of abortion, especially with friends, family, or coworkers, here's some basic ways to get started. Number 1, abortion in the news. Increasingly, we are seeing more and more stories concerning abortion in our news, and not just in kind of off to the side pro-life or pro-choice news sites, which there are plenty of, but just in our mainstream media news sources. Legislation, judicial cases, court cases, it's coming up more and more often. So this can be a really great way to start that conversation. It can be as simple as, hey, did you see that story about that pro-life bill in Ohio? Okay, or that abortion bill in Texas. Or there's a Supreme Court case coming up that's about abortion. Did you guys hear about that? And chances are they may not have, unless they're really actively following the news all the time, and unless they're that person who's always watching the news, who's always reading news stories, they may not have heard of it. And that's your opportunity to explain it to them and have the first time that they hear it be in a pro-life context. So let's say it's the bill to ban abortion after the heartbeat is detected. You can explain it as, hey, I saw this really cool bill where they're going to protect preborn babies after you can detect the heartbeat so you can't abort them. And that may bring up some controversy there, because you may have coworkers or friends, whoever's in this conversation, who may have very, very different views on abortion, and they may immediately react to that. Or you may have people who step back and think, wait, what are you talking about? What do you mean preborn babies? What do you mean abortion? What are we talking about here? And that may kind of open up that conversation. But news stories are a great way to get that started. Number 2, your own involvement or volunteering. If you are already involved in the pro-life movement, or maybe you volunteer with a pregnancy center or another pro-life group, this is a great way to talk about it. Say, hey, this Saturday I got to go and volunteer with this pregnancy center. It was a really awesome experience. And they're going to say, what do you mean? What's a pregnancy center? And that's where you have the opportunity to explain the life-saving work that pregnancy centers do, which we will address in a later video. Another way is to say, hey, I participated in 40 Days for Life this Saturday or this Wednesday or whenever it was. And that's another great way for somebody to be asking you the questions rather than you kind of bringing up your worldview to them. You're inviting them in to ask the questions and be the curious one. And that's a great place to be, because now they're asking you, and your answers are a way of bringing them into this conversation without putting them on the spot. It's also a very casual thing to do, especially if somebody just asks you how your weekend was and you spent the weekend doing something pro-life. It's a very honest answer. They asked. And again, you're not putting them on the spot. Number 3 is the straightforward ask. If the above approaches don't really work for you, maybe you're more of a straightforward, blunt person, you can straight up ask somebody, hey, what do you think about abortion? Trust me, I've done it to plenty of strangers all over the country. I really think in our society we need to stop being afraid of controversy, because it has not helped us. We've let a lot of things go under the surface, and we've let a lot of things slide by without addressing them, and that is how we've had a legalized abortion for so long, for more than 40 years. So I think we really need to be bringing these conversations up and out into the open and not treating them like landmines that we need to step around. Part 3, pro-choice arguments and pro-life responses. When you're talking to a pro-choice person about abortion, there's really only one question that needs to be answered, and that is, what is the preborn? Is the preborn a clump of cells that is simply part of the mother's body, or is it a new, unique human individual? If it's the latter, there is no justification for abortion, and anything that the pro-choice person offers is going to be inadequate. Now, of course, you don't want to say this to them. That's not going to help your conversation go very well. But you need to understand that whatever argument they throw at you, if it doesn't answer that basic question, it's a sidetrack. So you're going to have to get the conversation back on focus. And the focus is, what is the preborn? Who is the preborn? And so there's a bunch of different ways to talk about this. One of the most common ones is called SLED. It's an acronym, and it covers kind of all of those basic pro-choice arguments, your basic starter level of rhetoric. SLED stands for size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, and this acronym covers everything. So size. A lot of times when you talk to pro-choice people, especially those who are not very engaged in the pro-choice movement, they're very, they know some surface level rhetoric, and that's about it. You talk to them about the preborn, you talk to them about abortion, they're going to say, well, it's only this big. It's this tiny little thing, it's a speck. And that's a size argument. Now, you're not going to say, oh, that's a size argument, that's SLED. That's not going to work for you. But instead, if you get to them in the way where you're saying, hey, the size of a human being does not affect their value. The question is this a human being? Because if this is a human being, it doesn't matter what size they are. You know, we don't judge human beings on their size. We don't say, oh, you're taller, so therefore you're more valuable. So that's kind of a great way to answer that one. Level of development. That's another huge one that pro-choice people will bring into. Well, they're underdeveloped. They're not finished developing yet. And there's a few different analogies and kind of thought experiments that you can use in these situations, and you can look those up, and they're great. But the basic idea is that we are on a continuum of development. We don't stop developing. When we are fully developed human beings, we're about 25 years old. And at that point, there's still growth, change, everything happening within the human body. There is no finished point. There is no point where, okay, now we're static, now we're done. That doesn't exist. And so trying to say, well, they're not developed enough yet is a slippery slope. At what point are you developed enough? Because full brain development does not finish until 25. So are 21-year-olds not human? Are they not people? Is it okay to kill them? And they'll say, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. But I'm talking about this tiny little thing that can't survive on its own. It can't survive outside the mother's womb. And that really kind of counts as the last two parts of SLED. So environment is the next one, and we're just going to follow the acronym, even though technically degree of dependency came in there. But environment is the idea that inside the mother's womb, it's inside the mother's body, and therefore the mother has control. And therefore it's not, the preborn baby is not on its own. And this is a really common one as well. And in fact, our law is based around it. Right now, our abortion law is such that only those outside the womb are truly protected under the law. We have some abortion restrictions, but those have exceptions, and there's no guarantee of personhood or rights inside the mother's womb. And so that's really kind of the default explanation for people as to why abortion is okay, but infanticide is not. And so explaining, hey, the location of a human being does not affect their value in any other circumstance. There is no other time where we judge a person's value, their rights, their humanity, based on where they are, or even in their ability to survive in their environment. When an astronaut goes into space, they have a spacesuit, they have a space station, a spaceship, whatever it is, and they need to be inside that in order to survive. They need to have that personal protective equipment, that gear, in order to survive. The fact that without that gear they would die does not mean they are not people. It just means they're outside of their comfort zone. They're outside of their normal environment. And so that's a really great analogy that you can use to kind of bring people back to that core issue is this a person? Because if it's a person, it doesn't matter where they are. It doesn't matter how developed they are. It doesn't matter how big they are. And it doesn't matter how dependent they are. And that's our last one, is degree of dependency. So dependency is the idea that, well, the preborn child is dependent on the mother, and therefore it cannot be counted as a full person. But dependency, like size and level of development, is a continuum. There is no point where we are truly, truly independent, where we do not depend on any other human being for our own survival. There are people who try to go out into the wilderness and live on their own and to be completely self-sufficient, completely independent. But even then, their survival ability is limited without another person. Even just having one other person out there with them increases their survival chances untold numbers, okay? I'm sure somebody has the numbers out there. And if you have them, great, leave them in the comments. But having another person out there with you increases your survival. Not just because, okay, now you're combining resources, you're combining skills, but also because we are social creatures. We need each other. We need other people around us. So to say that, oh, this preborn child is dependent and therefore not human, ignores everything else we know about human biology and human survival. So that's kind of the full acronym there: size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. Another common argument is financial or need arguments. The mother is, she's a single mom. She is low income. She might lose her job. There's all kinds of possibilities where she can't afford to have this child. And again, this is one of those where we go back to that one question, that basic question: is the preborn child a human being? Because if they are, then it's never justifiable to kill them, regardless of the financial status of the mother. If we have a mother who has 5 children, okay, she's low income, and maybe she just lost her job. She's really struggling. She doesn't know how she's going to take care of her kids. We're not at this point talking about how she ended up having 5 children, how she got into this situation. None of that matters. She's in this situation now. She has 5 children. She just lost her job. She's trying to figure out how to provide for her family. We do not suggest to her, kill one of your children. We don't do that. And yet, if she was pregnant, there are many people who would tell her to have an abortion. And so that's a disconnect that we have to resolve. We have to say, wait a second, what is the difference between that preborn child that you're willing to sacrifice for the well-being of everybody else and one of her already born children? And that's usually where we get back into SLED. That's usually where the pro-choice person says, well, no, we're talking about an underdeveloped, we're talking about someone inside the womb, we're not, and we get back into that SLED argument. So that kind of help you pull the argument back to the central focus, which is the preborn child a human being? Number 3, which I think is actually the most common that I've gotten from those who are not actively involved in the abortion issue, is legality. And legality is just the idea that, well, abortion is legal. It's the law of the land, especially for millennials, for people around my age and younger. This is a really powerful argument because we have never known a society in which abortion was not legal, because it was legalized in 1973 with Roe versus Wade and Doe v. Bolton that completely wiped out all legislation that was on the books. And everything since then has been attempts by the pro-life movement to build back up that legislation to protect those preborn children as much as we can under the current judicial umbrella there of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. But those 2 court cases really just wiped out every protection we had for preborn children. And we have not known a society where preborn children were protected since then. So when we talk about legality, we want to understand that the law is not some perfect overarching system of morality. We cannot depend on the law for our morality. There are plenty of examples of this. And really the basic idea is, when you're talking to that person who cites the legality, what you ask them is our law perfect? Is there nothing at all that you want to change about the laws that we have right now? And most likely they're going to say no. They most likely have some other issue. And it could be Second Amendment. Maybe they want gun control. Maybe they want less gun control, whatever it is. Maybe it's free speech. Okay, maybe it's Medicare or welfare or homelessness. Maybe there could be all these different things that a person would like to change if they had the ability to change whatever they wanted about our law. It's never perfect. And once we recognize that the law cannot be our standard of morality. That just because something is legal does not make it right. And just because something is illegal does not make it wrong. We cannot use the law as our morality. These are just a few basic arguments. I will cover more of them in next week's episode, where we'll talk about some of the hard cases and more difficult arguments, such as bodily autonomy, rape, and other things that come up like that. But if you have other arguments that you've heard and you'd like me to address, please leave them in the comments below or click the link to submit them as a question for next week's episode. Part 4, pro-life advocacy, how to get involved. There are as many ways to get involved in the pro-life movement as there are pro-life people. Everybody can find their own niche, their own way of supporting the fight to protect preborn human beings and all people at all stages of life. I'm going to briefly touch on a few of the most popular ways to support the pro-life movement without going full-time. Then I'll talk about a few ways to get involved if talking to people, especially talking to strangers, is not so much your thing. My personal favorite method of supporting the pro-life movement is sidewalk advocacy, which I will talk about in a future video. Sidewalk advocacy is being an advocate for the mother and the preborn child out there on the sidewalk in front of the abortion facility where the abortion is about to take place. So sidewalk advocacy is the idea of going to the place where abortions are happening at the time when abortions are happening and speaking out and offering a helping hand to that mother, to that child who's about to go through this terrible thing. I've been a sidewalk advocate since 2013, and it really has been a huge experience for me, and I've seen so many people change their mind, choose life, and walk away from a decision that they would have otherwise regretted. Another way to be involved in the pro-life movement is to get your church involved. This is something I've been personally working on with my church that I attend, and it's something I think everybody who goes to church, whatever church you go to, should be thinking about. If your church already has an active pro-life organization, committee, whatever it is, get involved in that. It's a really easy way to get started because they're probably already doing a lot of awesome things that you may not be aware of. Get involved, sign up, tell them, hey, I'm here, what do you need me to do? That's a really great way to get started. If your church doesn't have something like this, talk to your pastor, talk to your priest, whoever it is, talk to other people at your church, ask them, hey, what could we do? How could we help? Preborn children, how could we help mothers in need? Now, I will address all these kinds of issues in a later video, but you may not get the response you're hoping for from your church. It happens. There are, unfortunately, more and more churches out there that do not see a value in helping the preborn children and helping their mothers without involving abortion. If you're using some of the things we've talked about already in this video and you're continuing to educate yourself, you may be able to help turn that perception around for your congregation and really get them on board. And again, we'll talk about that in a future video. Another one is social media advocacy, and that's something I've also been involved in for a long time now, and I've really, I've really seen how social media can impact people. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, you don't want to get involved in discussions about controversial issues on social media. It doesn't end well. It's not productive. Nothing good comes from it. And that's true in certain circumstances. I don't recommend being like on Facebook with your friends and family. I don't recommend just constantly trying to argue with them on Facebook or getting in arguments in the comments of a Facebook post. That usually does not work well. However, having an active pro-life social media presence can be a very positive thing. I've run a Tumblr blog called Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty for several years now. It's gone under a couple different names, but I've run this blog since 2013, pretty much. And I've been talking about abortion, talking about resources for women going through a crisis pregnancy. I've talked about other issues as well, other stuff that's important to me. And I've seen some awesome impacts from it. I currently have about 4,000 followers, and I've had several women message me telling me that because of my blog, they chose life for their child. And I've had other women who've messaged me asking for help in a crisis pregnancy situation. And those experiences alone are enough for me to keep doing social media advocacy, for the rest of my life. I don't see a point where I would stop doing that. Because I have seen positive impacts, because I have seen it help people. So if it's done right, it can be done. And again, I will go into more detail in a future video about what social media advocacy looks like in the pro-life movement and how to do it right. Now, if you're not big on talking to people, if you're more introverted, that's okay. I was too. I'm still an introvert. Surprise. Believe it or not, I'm, talking to people, especially talking to strangers, is not on the top of my list of things I want to do with my day. However, I took a kind of fake it till you make it approach, and because I wanted to be involved in the pro-life movement so badly, that I pushed myself out there, I pushed myself out of my comfort zone, and I found that I actually can talk to people, and it's not as bad as I thought it would be. But if that's not you, that's okay. There's so many ways to be involved in the pro-life movement. Primarily, outside of the things I've already talked about, there's a lot of roles for volunteering, and there's a lot of need for donations of either material donations, financial donations, whatever it is. So if you happen to be gifted with time or with money or with whatever it is, there are a lot of ways where you can take those gifts and give them back and really support a lot of people. So I'm going to go through a few different kinds of organizations that would really benefit from your volunteering hours or from your dollars if that's the way you want to go. Number one is pregnancy centers. Pregnancy centers are the front lines of the pro-life movement. They are where pregnant women in crisis pregnancies who are considering abortion are walking in and receiving support and help to make the choice for life for their child. So supporting these however you can is so important. It's really important to me to talk about pregnancy centers with people and to help people understand what it is they do, why they're out here, why we need them. And we'll have a future video on that to go into more detail. And I'm hoping to have some guests on here to talk about pregnancy centers, some people who actually work at and run pregnancy centers to kind of give that perspective. You also want to look for community advocacy organizations. I live in the Austin, Texas area, and so our local pro-life advocacy is the Central Texas Coalition for Life, and they do a lot of awesome work, including training sidewalk counselors and running 40 Days for Life campaigns, which we'll talk about in a second, and just having that community awareness of the abortion issue, and also coordinating with pregnancy centers and other resources to make sure that women have access to the help and support that they need. So finding that organization in your community, whether it's a local Right to Life chapter, whether it's another pro-life organization in your area, I'm sure whoever it is, they would be happy to make use of your volunteering hours or your dollars. As I mentioned, 40 Days for Life. If you're not aware of it, please just Google 40 Days for Life. Right now, pause the video, go Google it, go look at their website, understand what it is they do, because it's a really amazing organization. It's an amazing campaign, and it has saved so many lives. It has helped so many people, and it has such a huge impact. Every pro-life person should know about 40 Days for Life and should understand what they do. Essentially, twice a year for 40 days, we have people outside abortion facilities all over the world. Yes, all over the world. Not the country, not your state, not your community, the world. People outside abortion facilities praying for an end to abortion, praying for the mothers, for the children who are impacted by abortion, praying for the workers, hoping that they will choose another line of work, choose to leave the abortion industry, and just, in general, being a positive pro-life presence in front of those facilities. And it works. Abortion facilities have closed down. Women have changed their minds, have saved their children. It's been amazing. So look up your local 40 Days for Life campaign. If you don't want to talk to people, that's okay. You don't need to talk to people. That's one big thing is people are like, oh, I don't want to be confrontational. I don't want to be in that situation. You don't have to be. Volunteering with 40 Days for Life is going out in front of the abortion facility to pray, not to protest, not to hold up signs and yell at people, none of that. It's to pray peacefully. And so it's literally it's the simplest way you can get involved, but it's also one of the most effective. It really does not require a huge time commitment. Usually people sign up for an hour a week, which, we can all find an hour here or there a week. And you're not having to talk to anybody. It's not manual labor. You're not painting anything. You're not building anything. You're standing there and praying. So it really is an amazing opportunity that anybody can do. Anybody can do this. And finally, political and lobbying organizations. There are a lot of pro-life organizations out there that do a lot of amazing work in state legislatures, the national Congress legislature, supporting pro-life bills to help protect the preborn. A lot of these groups can really use help they can use donations definitely, but they can also oftentimes use help with stuffing envelopes or making phone calls. There's a lot of kind of grassroots things that they can use help with. Your local Right to Life chapter is a good one. In Central Texas, we have the Texas Alliance for Life. They do a lot of amazing work, and so just understanding who those people are in your community. We also have the Susan B. Anthony list in Washington, D.C., and a lot of other great conservative organizations that also take on that pro-life issue as something that's really important to them. If you have questions about pro-life arguments, pro-life responses to pro-choice arguments, anything about the pro-life movement, anything about abortion, anything about any of these life issues that we're going to be talking about on this show, if you have any of those questions, please click the link in the description below and send those questions my way. I want to dedicate a little bit of time at the end of every episode to answer those questions from viewers. So definitely I want to see those from you and I want to answer them. I'm hoping that I get such a flood of questions that I can't get to all of them in one episode, and that I start building up kind of a backlog so that every episode I have a few questions I can answer. So that's what I'm hoping for. So send them my way, get them out there. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for watching this first episode of Lifetime with Katie. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And again, please send any questions my way. And please remember to hit like, hit subscribe, and so you don't miss future episodes. Next week, we will be talking about the hard cases of apologetics. Otherwise, have a great week, and please tune in next time.